the problem of allegiance to personalities, and that this is a problem. This is a problem in a lot of areas of our society, but it's also a problem in the church, where people get, for lack of a better term, what might be called preacheritis. They get attached to a preacher, and then whatever that preacher says is right, and whatever he does is right, and he can say or do no wrong. And that creates problems for a church, especially if a situation arises where a preacher decides to leave, or if an eldership decides that he needs to leave. Those are issues that can cause a lot of difficulties in local churches, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. I've got some things I want to mention specifically about this, but we also have people have political allegiances, that they have allegiances to political figures, they have allegiances to political parties, without respect to what that party might teach or believe. That might look, I'll just be honest with you. I'll just be straightforward. I don't know how any Christian can support the Democratic Party. I don't see how the allegiance is there when you have a political party that has as a platform the idea that women can be men, and men can be women, and men can have babies, and men can breastfeed, and homosexuality is just as normal as everything else, and you can kill babies up to the point of birth, and murder them in the womb. How could anybody profess to be a Christian and support that party and the people that run in it? But it's because there's an allegiance to a party that has really nothing to do with the principles involved. But people have those types of allegiances. Listen, there are people that have that type of allegiance to the president. That everything Donald Trump says and does is right and good, and he can do no wrong. And look, that's really no better than the other side, if you just want to be honest about it, because it's an unqualified and undiscerning allegiance. Well, the same thing happens in the church. People have those types of allegiances to preachers, to preaching schools, to colleges, lectureships, and magazines. Of course, the Brotherhood papers are almost a thing of the past now that everything's gone digital. And when I first started preaching here in the first 4 or 5 years, I used to get a dozen or 15 different bulletins every week. I got the Gospel Advocate, and I got the Spiritual Sword, and I used to get Seek the Old Paths out of Corinth, and the one out of Texas from years and years ago. Can't even remember what it is now, but I used to get a lot of papers, and I enjoyed that. And the digital age killed that for me, because I'm a guy that wants something in my hands. But there were guys that were aligned with various publications, and sometimes the guys in those publications go to war against each other over some issue that I didn't think amounted to hill beans. And so when you have guys that have allegiances like that, again, it's an unqualified, undiscerning allegiance. And by the way, I wouldn't want anybody to be attached to me that way, because I know me, and I know at least I know some of my shortcomings and fallibilities, and I wouldn't want anybody to overlook those things and to think of me, certainly not any higher than I might deserve, because I don't deserve. But those types of things do happen, and they also they happen when preachers stay somewhere a long time. And just be honest, I've been here a long time. As far as I know, Vance Hutton's the only guy got more tenure than me, and I think he's got 42 years at Double Springs. So I'm still a fur piece behind him. But we have to be careful. We have to be careful about those things in relationship to our ideas concerning the church and things that are related to the church. The cure jump down to number 3 at the bottom there, below those bullet points. The cures for division in the Corinthian church. And of course, Paul asked that series of questions in chapter 1. Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? And these are rhetorical questions in that the question is asked with the answer already concluded in the question, and it's designed to make people think. Well, no, you weren't baptized in the name of Paul. Paul was not crucified for you. Christ is not divided, and so the cure for allegiance to personalities is to be, number one, is to be focused on Christ. In the third line, into the third line says, he stated that his message, presentation, and behavior among them should not have led to Paulism. Paulism just means to be a follower of Paul as opposed to a follower of Christ. And Paul's saying, look, I didn't do anything to warrant this. In fact, I did everything I could not to have this. You get to chapter 2, he says, I was determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. In other words, Paul said, I had a singular message, and the name of Paul was not anywhere in that message. I wasn't pointing anybody to Paul. I wasn't pointing anybody to Apollos or Peter. I was trying to point everybody to Jesus, and there is no excuse. There is no excuse for people to have misconstrued that and put me on a pedestal that I don't, where I don't belong. And he talked about setting forth. It says, he set forth the humble, true position, of all preachers. In chapter 3 and verse 5, it says, who is Paul and who is Apollos, except for ministers through whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one. So even when he talks about that they're just simply the conduits or the servants of Jesus, Paul still points back to Jesus. He says, as the Lord has given to each one. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And then verse 7, he who plants is nothing, he who waters is nothing, but God who gives the increase. And so he sets forth a position of humility. I've got a friend of mine in Mississippi, and I won't name him because it would embarrass him. But the church where he preaches has got a lot of really, really good things going on. That church is growing. They're reaching out in their community. I mean, they are doing great, great things. And he calls me on occasion to ask me if I can help do this or talk to somebody about that or bounce an idea off of me. And every time I try to say something good about what's going on, man, he don't want to hear no part of it. He won't even, he won't even take this. This is the wrong way to say it, but you understand what I'm trying to say. He won't even take this much credit for any of it. But there is a sense in which a lot of these things are getting done because of what he's doing and his body of work and his body of knowledge. But he is a guy that absolutely wants zero light on him whatsoever. And I respect that. But at the same time, I'm still recognizing, these things don't get done if it's not for him. These things just don't get done if it's not for him. And so I respect him for what he's doing, but I also respect him for not wanting any of the spotlight to be on himself. But it's like, dude, I get tired of you running away from any type of commendation. It's okay for me to tell you you're doing a good job. Just say thank you and go on. but he does not want any part of any honor or praise. And then last, it says, he observes that instead of following them belonging to Paul, Apollos, and Cephas, the reversal was true, that Paul, Apollos, and Cephas actually belonged to them. That's what he's saying. He said, you don't belong to these men. These men belong to you. Insofar as they've made the sacrifices for you. they're doing what's in your best interest. They want what's best for you, and they're willing to humble themselves and to submit themselves in such a way as whatever it takes for you to succeed, they're going to do it. And so Paul's like, look, you don't belong to us; we belong to you. And I love that observation. And then sixth, it says he strongly emphasized that instead of their allegiance being to men, their allegiance should be to Christ and to the message of the cross. Now, by the way, this is not the first time that Paul had to deal with something like this. If you recall in Acts chapter 14, when Paul and Barnabas went to Lystra, that there was a man there who was lame, and he was healed by Paul's hands. Obviously, the Lord healed him. But Paul was the conduit through which the healing came. And when that man got up and started walking around, all the pagan priests gathered up and declared that Paul and Barnabas were gods. They said, the gods have come down among us. And they tried to gather up animals to do sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas. And they're like, no. We're men. We're men just like you. We have the same failings that any do. And it says, and with these things they scarcely restrained them from offering sacrifices to them. So, this was not a situation that was completely unfamiliar to Paul. It certainly wouldn't have been a situation that was, foreign to Peter. With the miracles that Peter and the apostles worked in the early part of the church. And so, and I'm just telling you this to tell you that people have always been the same for all of humanity. We might know more things than people 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago. There are things that we know that they never knew. But so far as just the essence of humanity and the things that tempt us, they may not be in the same form, but they fall in the same general category: lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, and the pride of life. God wrote that to us 2,000 years ago. It was true then, and it was true long before, because Eve was tempted in the garden by the lust of the flesh. The fruit was good for food. Lust of the eye, the Bible says it was pleasant to the eye, and it was desirable to make one wise. Pride of life. So from the very beginning in the garden to 4,000 years later, when John wrote his first epistle, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, the devil tempted Jesus with the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. And all of our temptations are still the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. In our essence, we are no different than any human beings who have ever lived. We fall into the same failings, the same entrapments that they did. They just look different now than they did then. There's not a nickel's worth of difference in us. And so, if the church fell, and by the way, I think we can see this in the fact that I've illustrated that the church falls into the same entrapments that the Corinthians fell into. These things, think about this. Moses and the Israelites fell into those entrapments. They followed the 10 spies as opposed to the 2. They followed the sons of Korah as opposed to following Moses. There's just been this worship of personalities for all of human history. And so we can take these things and be admonished and encouraged by them. I made a note at the bottom. Of page 15, talking about when preachers leave but don't go far enough. That happens sometimes. It happened in the church where I used to work before I came here in Paris. Preacher had a falling out with the eldership, and they had to part company. And he went 5 minutes down the road. He went 5 minutes down the road and carried about 130 or 140 or 50 people with him. That church went from having 35 people one Sunday to 175 the next Sunday. That's not good. That's not healthy. that's following a man. But those types of things happen. They happen, but they shouldn't. Brother Winkler used to say this, and I took it to heart a long time ago when I first heard him say it. He said, I'm going to make sure I get this exactly right, or as close as possible. He said, I would rather be the Roman soldier who thrust his spear into the side of our Lord than to ever cause division in the Lord's church. That's a pretty stout statement, isn't it? I'd rather be the Roman soldier who thrust his spear in the side of our Lord as to ever be the cause of division in the church. And that has always stuck with me. Just, number one, because I love Brother Winkler so much, and to hear him say it, and because I had witnessed that very thing, through the course of my public ministry, or my public ministry. And so that ought to be the idea for all of us. We should never be the source of division in the Lord's body, endeavoring to keep the unity of the faith and the bond of peace. Ephesians 4:1-3.
So do you just ignore the problems, tiptoe around them?
No, that's not the same thing, and that's not being the source of division. When error is being taught, then Paul said, for example, in 1 Corinthians 11, he said, there must of necessity be divisions among you, that those who are approved might be made manifest. And the picture that I have in my mind is churning milk. What happens when you churn milk? Makes butter, right? Now it separates. But the churn is turmoil, right? It's stirring. And sometimes a church has to be stirred with turmoil in order to figure out who wants to do right and who doesn't want to do right. In the case that I talked about in the congregation where I was, there was no doctrinal problem there. There was no issue between the preacher and the elders so far as the teaching of the Bible. They just couldn't get along, and even the eldership divided. Some of the at least one of the elders went with him when he left and went somewhere else. That, to me, that's the type of division that I'm talking about. Like, there shouldn't be division in the church over those types of things. But there was a situation here a number of years before I came, that the preacher who was here, who was Alan Allard, began to be enamored with the Boston movement. And that may not mean anything to any of y'all, but it was a cult-like movement in the church that started as the Crossroads movement at the University of Florida in the 1970s, and then evolved into a cult known as the International Churches of Christ, the Boston movement. Well, Alan was enamored with that, and Grover Burleson could hear, as one of the elders, he could hear some of that creeping in to Alan's preaching. And he and B.A. called him in to a meeting and asked him, do you believe this, and is this what you're starting to introduce into your preaching? And he said, yes. And they said, you'll either change your preaching or change your address. And he changed addresses. But it could have been the case that he might have, I'm glad that it wasn't the case, but it could have been the case that he would have created a following. He could have, in secret, could have been recruiting disciples to himself, and he could have split the church and gone somewhere else. But certainly Grover and B.A. wouldn't have been the cause of the division. Allen would have been the cause of division because he was teaching error. And my opinion is, and my conviction is that There is no problem that can't be overcome when people love the Lord and want to do right. I believe that. And if there's a problem with the teaching or the preaching, people that want to do right can sit down and discuss these things. But when people don't want to do right, then there is a division. But people who are upholding the truth we should never be the cause of division while we're upholding the truth. And we always want to do the right thing in the right way. And so not all division is wrong, but all division is at its root involves sin. Does that make sense? Not all division is wrong, but all division involves sin. Either it's a division over personalities, which would be a sin that should never occur, or it's a division that's caused by somebody teaching and not turning loose of error, and that is a sin. It's like you could say, not all divorce is sin, but all divorce involves a sin. Is that right? Not all divorces are sin, but every divorce involves a sin. Either two people who have failed in their marriage divorce, which is contrary to the will of God, or somebody's been unfaithful to their spouse, and that divorce was not a sin, but it was as the result of sin. And so I think the same principle goes with regard, I think, to what you're going. Yeah, we're not going to ignore problems. But I think people that love the Lord and one another can work through them. But when people refuse to, then that goes back to Matthew 18. If he won't hear the church, let him be unto you as a heathen and as a tax collector. So some division is necessary. But God-fearing Christians will never be the cause of it. I guess it might be the best way, easiest way for me to say it.
It's never wrong to do the right thing.
It's never wrong to do right. Yeah. And it's never right to do wrong. All right, let's keep going. Let's go to top of page 17. And this goes to what really the question that Jeremiah asked. We are to be a spiritual people. We have submitted to a spiritual birth. We are in a spiritual battle. We are recipients of all spiritual blessings. We render spiritual worship. We are stones in a spiritual house. We are to be spiritually minded, offer spiritual sacrifices, and possess the fruit of the Spirit virtues. And so, that's always a cure for division. Is to remember all of these spirit-minded or spirit-led, spirit-guided aspects of our lives in Christ. Following then, number 3, the recipe for spiritual success. To be workers, then to be workers together, and then to be workers together with God. Now that comes from it's 2 Corinthians chapter 11. We then as workers together with God beseech you not to receive the grace of God in vain. But I love that. Workers together with God. And that's a cure for division or the mind that leads to division. The book of Nehemiah is a good book to study in this respect, because of all the great things that Israel, in spite of all the great things that Israel did in going back and rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and all the great things that they did, and despite all the Bigthan and Teresh and all of the opposition that they overcame, there was still a problem. Because some were loaning their possessions with usury, interest. And there's a couple of passages there that says, and there were some of the princes who did not put their shoulder to the work. And that was a problem. In other words, as my reading of it is, some people thought they were too good. But those of us that want to work, Nehemiah 4:6, the people had a mind to work. If we're working and we're working together and we're working together with God, then that solves a lot of our problems because we're focused on the task at hand. Also in keeping with the idea that the idle mind is the devil's workshop. As long as we're working, we don't have time to be worried about these peripheral things that don't amount to a hill of beans. And then lastly here are number 4 and 5. So we are to live so that we can commend or recommend our religion. Paul said, imitate me, even as I also imitate Christ. Can we recommend our attendance patterns, our giving practices, our prayer life, our Bible study program or regimen, soul winning procedures, our recreational pursuits, our attitude traits? We ought to, every Christian ought to be able to recommend to everybody, do what I do in these respects, or do more. That's what he's getting at. Not that we're holding up ourselves as some paragon of virtue, or that we're holding up ourselves as the example. But the point is, and it's not that any of us are ever going to be perfect in these endeavors, but people ought to be able to see that we're serious about these things. We're not going to be perfect, but we are serious about pursuing holiness. Pursuing unity and pursuing the lost and all of those things that are tied up in there, number 4. And then, we're to be mature. Growth and development are biblical requisites. Grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 18. We're to grow up into Him, all things who is the head. Ephesians 4. 15 and 16. In other words, Christ is the head, and the body is to grow in all things. Every part of the body is to grow into the head, which is Christ. And then there's a text box there at the bottom of 17 called the marks of maturity. The marks of maturity, and this is a really good list. It's not all encompassing, but it's a good place to start. The ability to consume solid food. Now that's talking about biblical teaching. That we don't have to be spoon fed every little thing all along the way. Look, and I realize when I'm teaching the book of Romans, I think I counted up 99 class sessions. 99 class sessions on the book of Romans. We did a pretty good job of covering the book of Romans. And some of those things sometimes they're difficult to understand. Sometimes they run contrary to what we've always heard, or we've not considered some of the things that they teach. But I was really pleased with the way that study went. That I didn't have to sit and spoon feed everybody every step of the way. Proper discernment, that is the ability to make good decisions. I talked to my boys, I guess it was on Monday at Maywood. I don't know if I told you I got 48. I got 48 boys in my class, and I said, the one thing I want to try to encourage you to do is understand how important it is to make good decisions. So because there are people that are my age that still to this day don't know how to make good decisions. They're just going to make bad decisions because that's all they've ever done. So, but you're going to be the total of your decisions. Because whatever I am right now and whatever you are right now is the culmination of every decision that you have ever made. You are what decisions you've made. And I am the decisions that I've made. And I wish, and I'm sure there are probably some in here that would agree with me, I wish I'd made some better decisions early on than I did. I'm happy to be where I am now, but I could be so much more if I had just made better decisions as a young person. But I'm glad that at least somebody taught me how to make some good decisions, and I made the decision. I mean, I've told you this before. When I got married, I made the literal decision to make good decisions, because I didn't want to end up, where some bad decision makers were, in their lives. And so, the ability to make good decisions, discernment, vision, wisdom, these are all signs of maturity. In other words, not just making a decision in the moment based on what is going to happen, right this minute. The ability to plant trees that you'll never sit under the shade of them. That's one thing I remember about being in England is they had date marks on these trees in the Windsor Park. This tree was planted on such and such date, 1732, by King so-and-so in honor of the birth of his daughter. And there's some little sapling planted that now that 4 men, can't put their arm around it. But the ability to do things that are going to benefit people well after we're gone. That's part of making good decisions. Steadfastness is a mark of maturity. The immature throw their hands up and give up at the first sign of trouble, the first sign of difficulty. But maturity brings steadfastness. Temperate with the tongue, controlling our tongues, James chapter 3, is a sign of maturity. And this is a big one. Non-retaliatory and forgiving is a sign of maturity. Not seeking to avenge ourselves or seeking revenge. Being easily entreated. That's the word found in James chapter 3 and verse 6. The wisdom which is from above is first pure and peaceable and easily entreated. In other words, if I get sideways with somebody or about something, how easy is it for people to come to me and say, "Look, we need to get this straightened out." That's the idea of being easily entreated. And so I would add James 3:16 to that text as well. All right, we've already had one bell. We're staring the other. I said we're going to finish 2, but I do want to talk about some things on page 18 and then get into chapter 3 next week. I really want to talk just briefly about the foolishness of God, Lord willing, next week. Not next week, week after next.